what distinguishes, you might say, the true man, the real man, from the alpha male, you might say, from the slave. Power and domination are all we truly care about. And when we get later in the semester to Thomas Hobbes, remember Thrasymachus. I'll just say that for now. Remember Thrasymachus when we get to Hobbes. Power and domination are all we care about. And what is true of individuals is also true for collective entities, collective nouns like states and cities. Every polity seeks its own advantage against others, making, you might say, relations between states a condition of unremitting war of all against all. In the language, if I can switch to the language of modern economics, one could say that for Thrasymachus, politics is a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. And the more someone wins, that means the more someone else will lose. And the rules of justice are simply the laws set up by the winners of the game to protect and to promote their own interests. It didn't take Karl Marx to invent or to discover that insight, that you might say the rules of justice are simply the rules of the ruling class. That comes straight out of Thrasymachus, Book 1 of the Republic. Well, how to respond? And again, Socrates challenges Thrasymachus with a variation of the argument that he'd used against Polemarchus. That is to say, do we ever make mistakes? That is to say, it is not self-evident, or it is not always intuitively obvious what our interests are. If justice is truly in the interests of the stronger, doesn't that require some kind of knowledge, some kind of reflection on the part of those in power to know what is really and truly in their interests? People make mistakes, and it is very possible to make a mistake about your own interests. And of course, Thrasymachus has to acknowledge this. Of course, the rulers make mistakes, and he tries to invent an argument that if a ruler makes a mistake, he's not really a true ruler. The true ruler is the person who both acts on his own interests and, of course, knows what those interests are. But the point that he admits is all, in a sense, that Socrates needs. Justice is not power alone. Justice requires knowledge. Justice requires reflection. And that is, of course, at the core of the famous Socratic thesis, that all virtue is a form of knowledge. All the virtues require knowledge and reflection at their basis. But much of the exchange with Thrasymachus turns on the problem of what kind of knowledge justice involves. If justice is a kind of knowledge, if justice equals self-interest, and self-interest requires knowledge, well, what kind of knowledge is that? Thrasymachus contends that justice consists of the art of convincing people to obey the rules that are really in the interests of others, the interests of their rulers. Justice, in other words, for Thrasymachus, is a kind of sucker's game, obeying the rules that really benefit others, largely because we fear the consequences of injustice. Justice is really something only respected by the weak, who are fearful of the consequences of injustice. Again, the true ruler, in some ways, is one, Thrasymachus believes, who has the courage to act unjustly for his own interests. The true ruler, he says, is one who is like a shepherd with a flock, but he rules not for the benefit of the flock, but of course for his own interests, the good of the shepherd. Justice, like all knowledge, is really a form, again, of self-interest. And so one can ask, right, is Thrasymachus wrong to believe this? And I realize I'm moving over this very quickly, but is Thrasymachus wrong to believe that? Socrates wins the argument in Book One with a kind of, you might even say, sleight of hand. Both he and Thrasymachus believe that justice is a virtue, but Socrates says, what kind of virtue is it to deceive and fleece other people? Thrasymachus is forced to admit that the just person is a fool, Thrasymachus believes, is a fool for obeying laws that are not beneficial to him, while the best life, Thrasymachus believes, is doing maximum injustice to others, doing whatever you like. And with that realization, we see a very dramatic moment in Book One, even in the book as a whole. Thrasymachus blushes. He blushes when he begins to when he realizes that he has been defending the claim, not that justice is a virtue, but that justice is something that is really a form of weakness. Thrasymachus himself seems to be embarrassed by his defense of the tyrannical life, of the unjust life. The suggestion Plato seems to be making by making Thrasymachus blush is, despite all of his tough talk, right, that he's not as tough as he appears to be, as he wants to think of himself to be. He's shamed by the fact that he has been defending injustice in the tyrannical way of life. And so it appears the three conversations end. Book One ends with uncertainty about what justice is. We have had three views of Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. They have all been refuted, but no clear alternative seems to have emerged. Certainly Socrates has not really proposed an alternative to Thrasymachus in his exchange with him. He has only, as it were, forced Thrasymachus to see that the logic of his ideas, the logic of his argument that justice is in the interests of the stronger, is a defense of tyranny and is a defense of the unjust way of life. So all of Book One is really a kind of warm-up for what follows in the rest of the book. We find out, presumably, what justice is. Until then, until that point, we have no reason to really give up on our current existing ideas about what justice is. And this is where the two most important figures of the Republic begin to make their voices heard. Those are Glaucon and Adeimantus. Glaucon tells Socrates that he is dissatisfied with the refutation of Thrasymachus, and so should we. Thrasymachus has been shamed. He has been forced to see the logic, where the logic of his argument takes him, but that is not the same thing as being refuted. Thrasymachus is really, as it turns out, a kind of girly man who is ashamed to be seen defending the unjust life. But why should we be ashamed to praise injustice? Glaucon challenges Socrates. It is not enough to show that justice is wrong, Glaucon says. What we need is to hear why justice is good, or more precisely, to hear justice praised for itself. Is there, in your opinion, Glaucon asks Socrates, a kind of good that we would choose because we delight in it for its own sake? 358a. Is there a kind of good that we delight in for its own sake? And this is where the rubber hits the road. Who is Glaucon? Glaucon and Adeimantus are the brothers of Plato. And other than their appearance in this book, there is no historical record left about them. But Plato has given us enough. In the first place, they are young aristocrats. And Glaucon's desire to hear justice praised for its own sake indicates something about his scale of values. It would be vulgar, he believes, to speak of justice or any virtue in terms of material rewards or consequences. He does not need to hear justice praised for its benefits. He's indifferent to the consequences. Rather, he claims that he wants to hear justice defended the way that no one has ever defended it before. The brothers desire to hear justice praised for itself alone, and that seems to be expressive of their own freedom from mercenary motives and incentives. It reveals to us something about their idealism and a certain kind of loftiness of soul. And certainly the brothers, we find out, are not slouches. They are not slouches at all. Although it is easy to remember that later in the dialogue, most of their contributions seem to be of the form of yes, Socrates, no, Socrates. They seem to be rather passive interlocutors. Their early challenges to Socrates show them to be potential philosophers. That is to say, the kind of persons who might one day rule the city. Of the two, Glaucon seems to be the superior. He is described as the most courageous, which in that context means the most manly, the most virile. And later Socrates admits that he has always been full of wonder at the nature of the two brothers. And at 368a, he cites a line of poetry, you remember, written about them for their distinction in battle. They have been in war. They have been tested in war.